What is going on, guys? Hey, I wanted to come back to you this evening and bring you an episode with Thomas Sowell. And Dr. Sowell is talking to a gentleman over at the Hoover Institute. They have a show or a podcast or whatever. And he is talking about his book. But in the two clips I'm going to show you, he talks about disparities in racial groups and income and economic conditions. And in the other clip, he's talking about the welfare state and how the welfare state has really had a negative impact on the black family. And it really kind of overall, like how these programs that are set up the way they are then have a negative impact on every group. But anyways, guys, if you would, please like and subscribe to the channel. And for those that already have, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Seaports around the world, but most rivers in Eastern and Southern Europe are quite different.
Yes.
What's the difference, and what bearing is that had on economic development?
Well, the rivers in Eastern Europe tend to flow into lakes and inland seas, and so when you get to the end of the Danube or the Don, you are not out in the open ocean.
You're the Black Sea or the Caspian.
That's right. And then if you want to get to the Atlantic, you have to go the entire length of the Mediterranean to get out there. The rivers in Russia, most of those empty into the Arctic Ocean, which is not quite as convenient as the Atlantic or the Pacific. And what that means is that you can't have the commerce, you can't have industry and whatnot to the same extent that you have. More importantly, you're not connected with the rest of the human race to the same extent. And one of the major findings throughout the book is that isolation almost invariably means poverty and backwardness.
In the mountains,
yes.
If you live in Eastern Europe or Russia and you're cut off from the rest of the world, isolation leads, in fact, well, we'll get to this in a moment, but it seems even to have an effect on cognitive ability, prolonged isolation.
Oh, sure. Well, certainly in terms of not just sheer knowledge, you don't have the same.
It would seem to me you don't know what you don't know if you don't have contact with other groups of people. You don't know what you don't know. What I'm saying is you don't know what they may have improved upon. And maybe you're doing something inefficiently. So, yeah.
Same knowledge. But more than that, you're not aware of how the basic things of life are done differently in other parts of the world. And so people who are isolated will keep doing things for centuries or thousands of years. So, for example, when the British landed in Australia, they find the Australian Aborigines are living really at a Stone Age level. Similarly, when people from Europe came to the Canary Islands, the same thing. They had no idea of iron. In Australia, they had no idea of iron. It's one of the great sources of iron ore in the world.
I think of the Native Americans, it's like, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that everything that came out of the West was good, and we definitely had quite a few problems in the way that we did things, and the way that we, I think everyone can admit that slavery was wrong, and numerous other things that the Western, I'm not saying the Western people invented this stuff, they didn't, but when Western men arrived in America and they came in contact with the natives were living in kind of the Stone Age in a way compared to the Europeans. So, I think that it definitely has something to do with it.
Staying with geography for a moment, again, one of the themes that seems to me to run through the book is this question of your resistance to notions of, to attempting to impose notions of morality on economic conditions. So, for example, with geography, some people happen to be born in Western Europe where the rivers lead to the sea, and some people happen to be born in Russia where some rivers lead to the frozen Arctic and some rivers lead to the Black Sea. And it's nobody's fault.
Yes.
It's luck.
Yes.
Or sheer happenstance. Nobody's robbing anybody else.
Yes, as one economic historian said, the world has never been a level playing field.
All right.
Well, the funny thing is, man, we seem to want to set up equity, and that's not always the case. The world's not going to be a level playing field. It's just not. And I guess in a lot of ways, we can't expect it to be it. And just because we see inequality does not mean there's really inequality in a lot of ways. Doesn't mean that it's not there for a reason. And the reason, it doesn't mean the reason's discrimination. It doesn't mean that. And, there are so many other factors involved. It's kind of like, and I think they're going to get into this here in a bit, but it's kind of like the whole notion of the welfare state. It's like maybe the welfare state made things the way they are in a way. Maybe they have more to do with inequality and with, between white people and black people. And, just look at they get into the birth rates, like the single mother birth rates. I think back in 1965, I think 25% of black kids were born in single parent households. And now I think it's like 75%. Yeah.
Cultural factors, another one of the large segments of the book. Let me quote to you again, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, quote, "Without the cultural prerequisites for developing natural resources into real wealth, the raw physical resources themselves are of little or no value," close quote. Tell us what you mean by cultural prerequisites.
Partly, that would be simply the knowledge of how to use things. As I mentioned in the book, the main difference between us and the caveman is simply human capital. Don't forget the caveman had all the natural resources we have today, and he had them in greater abundance because none of them had ever been used up. But he didn't have the knowledge that it would take to turn those to his own purposes.
We just know.
That's an interesting point. The caveman had more access to natural resources than modern humans do. But they didn't have the knowledge to make anywhere near the stuff that we make. And, it's like, again, they were rich in resources, but poor in knowledge, poor in putting things together. And, again, we evolved over time, and we became more, we learned more. We became more intelligent by trying new things and by watching other people and improving on things and in inventing stuff and improving on those inventions. And I get what he's saying. He's totally right about this stuff. And I've read two of his books. I haven't read the one they're talking about here, but he's an interesting guy.
No more.
Yeah.
We just know more. Now, you note that you note a certain productive capacity that certain cultural groups demonstrate. And you can see them because they demonstrate the same, let's call it industriousness, as they disperse to different parts of the world.
Yes.
Germans, Chinese, Lebanese, Jews, Indians, quote, the productivity is a matter of culture. That productivity is a matter of culture is shown by how many groups have arrived in various countries far poorer than the existing population and have nevertheless risen above the economic level of those who were there before them, close quote. Let's just choose, you name a lot of groups, it's a big book. Let me just toss one at you and see how you do. The overseas Chinese.
Oh my goodness, the overseas Chinese settled largely in Southeast Asia. Many of them came there with little more than the clothes on their backs. There was one Chinese millionaire in one of the countries who had in the foyer to his mansion this stick with a little cloth thing tied to it, because he walked into this place with that stick, all his belongings in this little cloth thing tied to his stick over his shoulder, and he took off from there.
All right. The Jews.
Oh my heavens, that's been in so many places. My gosh, the Lower East Side of New York, one of the most terrible places when the Jews landed. The poverty and squalor is just unbelievable. In fact, even as late as the late 1940s, when I went to school on the Lower East Side, I'd always heard that all Jews were rich. And when I saw the Lower East Side, I said, why are these rich people living like this? The buildings on the Lower East Side were older and in worse conditions than the buildings in Harlem where I lived.
And they don't live there anymore.
No.
Those neighborhoods have turned over?
Yes. And it went by generation. The generation that was there first, even when they rose up to where they could have moved, they didn't, because many of them were not fluent in English and so on. And so you could live on the Lower East Side knowing only Yiddish. Right. And find doctors, lawyers, anything you wanted, go into stores and so forth. And if you moved up to upscale places like Harlem, which was once Jewish, or to the Bronx, which at another time which became Jewish, you would lose that. The more acculturated people, the next generation who spoke English and were more familiar with American society, they lived in those kinds of places.
Got it. So why is it that in many instances that you detail, you get a subgroup, the Chinese move to Fiji. And why is it then that so often we see the pattern that the indigenous, the people who were there first, fail to get with the program? And to the contrary, not only do they not get with the program, learning the skills of productivity, they tend again and again and again to persecute the groups that came with nothing but achieve a certain level of affluence. So we have the Jews, that's an old story, ancient story, the persecution of the Jews. Declined substantially over the years at all three institutions, close quote. So, telegram to Mayor de Blasio. As diversity becomes championed in the city of New York over the last 40 years, 50 years, diversity actually diminishes at these very selective high schools. Why?
Well, it's that diversity really doesn't do anything for you. There are many cultural...
It doesn't do anything for you as a society? Or, I'm sorry.
As a society or the people in whose interests you're promoting diversity. In other words, when Black, Hispanic kids go to schools other than those three, they get a load of diversity. It doesn't do them any good. For example, as of about 2012 or 2014, I forget the exact one, the percentage of blacks at Stuyvesant High School was 1/10 of what it was 33 years earlier. So it's been a major retrogression. And so while they're being their heads full of diversity, the Asian students are learning math and science. Plus,
that's one thing I think of quite a bit too. That's one thing I think of quite a bit is while we are so concerned with equity, while we are so concerned with outcomes and making sure that everyone is equal to everyone else, we are not progressing. We're not. Other people in other countries are surpassing us because we're spending all of our time and resources towards making sure everything is equal, and we're not going to have an equal society if we're concerned with making all the outcomes equal. Yeah, there needs to be a equity. We need to have equality as far as opportunity, but if we have, and we're going to have a free society if we have equality of opportunity, but if we have equity, if we have equality of outcomes, by its very definition, things are not being equal. We're not, everyone is not equal. I'm not going to be a faster runner than these fast runners. I'm just not. And it's like also my age as well, but I'm not, I'm I have certain talents and certain abilities that and I'm not gonna. So what I'm saying is we can't always say that things need to be equal, and we need to have equal outcomes of people, and and that be our goal. Our goal should be equal opportunities. There should be equal opportunities. If you want to go to college, if you want to do this, if you want to do that, if you want to work in this field or whatever, you can do so if you work towards it. But if you don't work towards it, you're going to wind up working at McDonald's. And it's like, we can't take that person and put them in a position of authority, of whatever, because they are somebody who did not work to become what they need to become to be that person in authority. So, that's just one thing I think of quite a bit is if we really want to be equal, we got to be equal as far as opportunities, but not an outcome. I mean, by its very definition, that is not being equal. That's not looking at why, that's not taken into account a lot of the reasons why these people are in the position that they are in. If you're a doctor, you're in that position because you went to medical school or whatever to become that doctor. There needs to be equal opportunity. If you want to become a doctor, it doesn't matter where you come from if you really want to become that doctor. But things are always going to be equal. And people are always going to be interested in becoming something. So we got to take that into account too.
Another point against diversity is that in years past, those schools were so heavily Jewish that Stuyvesant was referred to once as a free prep school for Jews. Well, they weren't diverse, but it was very successful. And now Asian Americans outnumber whites by more than 2 to 1 in all 3 of those schools. It's still not diverse, but they're turning out people who do marvelous things. And that's what they're there for, to benefit the society, not to present this tableau that will please a handful of people.
Got it. All right. Political factors. This is the last of the large factors you discuss in wealth, poverty, and politics. Quote, Black Americans, a group often identified as beneficiaries of the welfare state in America, made considerable economic progress in the 20th century. Fine, of course, but much, if not most, this is the thing with you, the dependent clause is where the sting is, but much, if not most, of this progress was prior to the massive expansion of the American welfare state, close quote. That is so I want to say counterintuitive, because we hear so much about African American progress and civil rights and the establishment of the welfare state, that it really has become a kind of American intuition. Explain yourself, Dr. Sowell.
Well, as of 1940, 87% of black households were in poverty. Over the next 20 years, that declined to 47%. This is all prior to the civil rights laws, prior to the social welfare policies of the Johnson administration. Over the next 20 years, it fell an additional 18 points. But that was not, that was just the same trend continuing at a reduced rate. Affirmative action is even worse because, as I remember, I'm trying to think now, the numbers. I think it was something like, poverty rate was something like 30% among black households before affirmative action. And a decade after affirmative action, it was 29%. This is not the same as the 40% decline that occurred before there were any civil rights laws and before there was any social welfare state.
And so what happened between 1940 and 1960 was the post-Second World War economic boom.
It was that, but it was also the massive migration of blacks out of the South.
So they're getting better education and jobs.
That's right.
You son of a.